Hi, and welcome to this stress awareness workshop where we will be looking at ways to recognize, reduce, and manage the stress that you find in your life. My name is Courtney Edwards. I am the owner and coach at Solavi Holistic. I do behavioral health coaching and mindfulness meditation instruction as a way to help individuals who are feeling a little bit stuck take steps towards increased well being. And I also teach in the graduate mental health and school counseling programs at SUNY New Paltz. A lot of the content of today's program comes from my instructional repertoire at New Paltz, where we talk a lot about stress and anxiety and how to help clients deal with those. What are often considered negative emotions and how to better manage those in daily life. So, we're going to talk a few kind of fun facts that I wanted to open with about stress to kind of maybe take down some myths that people have about stress and how it shows up in their lives. First of all, stress is unavoidable. So I always kind of struggle with even how to talk about this topic in terms of stress management or stress reduction, because we can't always completely eliminate the stress in our life. And we don't necessarily want to, because in a lot of ways, stress is beneficial. And we're going to talk a little bit more about those points in just a second. When stress is not managed properly, when we let it kind of take over everything, or we don't have the appropriate coping skills, or when the stressors are so vast and so intense that we can't implement coping skills that we've used in the past, that's known as chronic stress. And chronic stress can lead to a variety of health concerns, and it can also morph more into crisis and then trauma if it continues to go unchecked. But it is possible to somewhat manage the stress in your life and to put yourself in a position where you are not dealing so much with a chronic stress condition, and you can put yourself in the best position to have some resilience against crises and trauma that may arise. So, as I mentioned, stress is inevitable. And you can see from the little collection of images here, these are just some everyday stressors that people may face, whether it's having a lot of, miserable traffic on a commute, or having kids get into paint and having children that are, making a mess in the house, work or finances. All of these things kind of add up, and it's just a very normal day to day situation, but those stressors can accumulate. And we can't completely eliminate all of those from our lives. And so it's important to just kind of remember that just because stress is evident in your life doesn't mean that you're doing anything wrong. And it really is just about how you learn to cope with those inevitable stressors. Um, so, we're going to talk more towards the end about specific steps that you can take to manage your stress load. So, stress serves a purpose. And I always like using the analogy of if you encounter a bear in the woods, and for those of us in the Rondout and Hudson Valleys, it is not uncommon to encounter a bear in the woods. I've done it on the trails while out running or hiking several times. And I just watched a bear make his way through my garbage last Tuesday night, right before garbage pickup day. So and they're going, those kind of moments, it's a good analogy because those kind of moments do elicit a stress response. And it's appropriate that that happens. And so stress can be really protective. It can be beneficial and adaptive in that it helps keep us safe, and it helps us be aware of danger, and it alerts us that we need to kind of shift directions, make a different decision. We need to go a different way to stay away from those dangers. One of the issues, though, is to kind of understand the way that stress works in the brain. So that kind of primal stress response, I often say, is not only the bear you encounter in the woods in the 21st century, but it's also related to the saber-toothed tiger that maybe our prehistoric forebears might have encountered. And the brain chemistry reaction to a stressful situation is actually embedded more strongly than a pleasurable brain response, because it was more important from a survival perspective that our prehistoric ancestors know where the danger was. They needed to really remember where the poisonous berries were, and they needed to remember where the den of dangerous animals were. And so that biochemical response from our neurological perspective is really strong, and it imprints itself. So we learn that. We actually learn that stress response as a behavior. And the more frequently that you're exposed to stress, the more deeply ingrained that stress response becomes, to the point that it actually can become habitual. And so that means that any slightly dangerous stimuli can result in this kind of hyperactive stress response. So it's important to kind of know that that's how our brains work against us a little bit, to understand sort of the evolutionary roots in that. This a lot of this stress response is coming from a survival place that isn't really necessary or adaptive in the 21st century. We're not being hunted by predators. We're not living out in the open. We have, homes with doors that shut and lock, as evidenced by the bear going through my garbage last week. I just let him be behind my closed door because I knew that I was safe. But it is important to kind of just recognize the biological functions of stress, and to understand that the way that that repetitive behavior, that repetitive response can actually start to embed itself on a granular level in your neurology. Not a lost cause, because there's lots of ways to kind of then unwire that and learn more appropriate responses to stressful situations. But it's kind of good info. It's a little bit nerdy, but I like neuroscience a lot. I think it's kind of cool. Our brains are amazing. So that leads us to kind of talking a little bit more about when stress gets out of control. So, and this can happen a few different ways. One is what I just talked about, this kind of habitual chronic stress response. And that happens when somebody encounters stressors and there's either ineffective coping, no coping, or you just can't get out of that situation. It's just a repetitive stress situation that even if you are able to try to cope with, it's almost like standing on the beach when the waves keep coming. At some point that wears you down, even if you've got good coping. So chronic stress can happen when the individual is not able to cope with the stressful situation, or is not able to leave the stressful situation. Then, in terms of intensity, that's when we start to look at things like crisis and trauma. And a lot of this work I first put together at the beginning of COVID, because so many things that would have been just sort of everyday stressors were amplified by the pandemic and by sheltering in place, and just sort of the overarching worry and concern and fear that a lot of people dealt with. So it started to take that regular everyday stress and bring it more into that realm of a crisis. And then when a crisis goes on unabated, and there's either no or ineffective coping, or you can't get yourself out of that situation, that's when we would start to look at trauma, and how that starts to implement in the body and in the brain as well. So a lot of the beginning coping of an everyday stress is going to help build resilience towards future crises and trauma. But then there will also be situations like COVID where you're not necessarily able to fully protect yourself. And so we'll talk a little bit about what that means too. So I wanted to just kind of touch briefly on what the difference is between stress and crisis, and how they differentiate. So, one of the things that really makes a difference is the amount of time that you have to prepare for a difficult set of circumstances, or how much you're able to anticipate it. And so, an example might be something like if you have an elderly family member who's been in poor health and they pass away, you have some time to kind of understand that that's coming. You have an opportunity to anticipate it. And so while it's really painful, it's not necessarily going to rise to the extent of a crisis, as opposed to if, for example, a child were to die. There's not necessarily that same degree of time to prepare, nor is there that anticipation, because we work on a base assumption that bad things don't happen to little kids, right? So some of those are some factors that will impact just sort of what might be a stressful situation versus what becomes a crisis situation. Or maybe thinking about it in less sort of emotional ways. If your car, you've got an older car with 200,000 miles on it, and you kind of know at some point it's going to break down, versus your car gets in an accident and now it's unusable, right? So that response is going to be a little bit different. Just sort of knowing that something's inevitably going to happen and having it happen with very little warning is how we would look at what is a stress and what becomes a crisis. Another factor that has an implication in this distinction is how much prior experience you may personally have with a set of circumstances, or how well you're able to connect to a community that kind of understands what's going on, and having that act as kind of a guide and a resource for you. And so, one of the things, like going back to the example with COVID, for most of us, we had never experienced anything like this before. We had never seen, a set of circumstances that was global, that hit with so much intensity, that disrupted every aspect of daily living. So not having kind of other experiences that we could draw on to be like, oh, okay, like I can deal with this because it reminds me of this other set of circumstances I've already lived through. I can employ those coping skills. When it's a completely brand new situation and a new set of circumstances, that really feels disempowering, because it's almost like you're in the crisis and you need to figure out how to cope with it all at the same time. So really having that prior experience to build off of, or being able to connect with other people who have gone through a similar thing, and being able to use that as a guide and a resource, can be one of the factors that will prevent a stress response from becoming a crisis. The other important thing is really just how long the stressor persists. And again, this is really relevant with COVID. If this had been, many of us back in March of last year thought, oh, we're going to be off of school for a couple of weeks and we're going to go back. And perhaps if that was the way that it played out, the emotional response that a lot of individuals have had would be vastly different than what I anticipate people are going to deal with moving out of this a year and a half, 2 years later. So really just the amount of time that you spend in stress or confronting that stressful situation is going to have some bearing on whether or not it becomes more of a crisis or even becomes a trauma. I've said from the beginning, I think that we are largely going to be confronting a collective trauma for a while after COVID. And I know that that's not always a popular opinion and it's a hard thing to say, but I think kind of, again, like being able to be aware of that, having that kind of forewarning that that might be what we're dealing with, can be really empowering in then figuring out ways to cope with it. And then finally, another really important factor when we're looking at that difference between stress and crisis is how much personal control or autonomy the individual feels like they have. So when you're in a situation where you feel like you have no control, you're feeling really disempowered, that is going to heighten that experience into more of a crisis or a trauma experience than something where you're able to say, like, a bad thing is happening right now, but I can take these steps to get out of it, and I can take these steps to cope with it. When you feel like there's nothing you can do to help yourself, that's when it can become more of a crisis or a trauma. So, I wanted to talk a little bit about stress and the body and what's happening internally when we are stressed, because this is one of the areas where I think it's most important to have some kind of awareness. Stress is really corrosive on the body, particularly persistent and chronic stress. Our systems weren't necessarily made to always be in this heightened state of awareness, and that state of hyperarousal. And so, really looking at the impact that chronic stress can have on the body might be a motivator for why you want to take some steps to work towards better coping. So, really kind of basic, something that I think a lot of people can relate to is muscle pain and tension. So, I know for myself, I carry all of my stress here. So, I tend to clench my jaw. I carry it kind of in my neck and my shoulders. I get all clenched up. And I've used a lot of kind of meditation practice and yoga practice to learn to recognize that when it's happening, and then take some deep breaths so I can, like, let all those muscles relax, because I definitely get a little clenchy. And so, recognizing that that does have kind of a negative effect if it's prolonged and you don't kind of change that muscle tension, you can actually start to have some like muscular and skeletal issues with that. A common diagnosis for people who struggle with high stress is TMJ, which happens when you clench your jaw, and it can actually start to impact the joint around the jaw. I experienced that when I was in grad school, and I thought I had an ear infection. So I went to the ENT, and he did a whole workup, and he's like, "There's nothing wrong with your ears." And then he said, "Tell me about your life." And I was sitting in his office with a pile of grad school textbooks on my lap. And so he started talking to me about stress. And we realized that I was clenching my jaw and probably grinding my teeth in my sleep. So I had to do some things in terms of lifestyle to stop doing that before I ground all my teeth down into little nubs. So just a little personal flavor to demonstrate the point. But we do tend to carry a lot of stress in our bodies, particularly in our skeletal and muscular systems. So, learning to kind of recognize that can be a really empowering way to start undoing that response. So, again, paying attention to where you feel stress. Do you feel your palms get sweaty? Do you feel your hands clenched? Do you feel it in your jaw or your neck? And then taking some steps to unravel all those tight muscles. Related to that are headaches. So, stress headaches can be a really common complaint for folks who are struggling with chronic stress. And it's just, an unnecessary pain that you don't necessarily have to continue to endure. Also notable is a lot of folks will have issues in their digestion, in their GI tract, and along bowel movements. So, irritable bowel syndrome does have some relationship with stress. And so, just being able to kind of go regularly and go without pain can be improved by monitoring stress. And then there's also just a lot of damage can be done in the esophagus and in the stomach lining, the way that our brain will signal to our body that there's stress happening. One of the things that it can do is release excess stomach acid, which can result in ulcers and some other types of painful conditions that impact digestion. And I didn't give this its own bullet point, but sort of in that realm of digestion, in that it's related to eating. Fluctuations in weight are common with folks who are struggling with stress. So, one of the neurochemicals that our body will release in stressful situations is cortisol, and so that's related to weight gain. this is all gonna like come together like a puzzle. But so when we're stressed, our brains release cortisol, which causes us to gain weight. And it's specifically for a lot of folks is like right around the belly, right around the middle. And so there's a correlation between folks who carry a lot of weight around their middle and heart disease. And part of it is that particular relationship between stress and the heart. So, looking at kind of the way all of those puzzle pieces fit together, and it helps draw that picture of just how damaging high levels of chronic stress can be on the body. Um, Elevated blood pressure can be an issue, as well as other cardiovascular issues. People who deal with chronic stress are at risk for stroke, heart attack, and some types of cancers have a correlation between stress and their development. And kind of connected to all of that too is the impact on the immune system. So when we're chronically stressed, we're fatiguing the system, and so our immune function is not going to be as strong as it could be. So then you are opening the door to a whole bunch of other types of illnesses, or just just generally not feeling well for long periods of time. One of the biggest culprits in sleep disturbances is stress, whether it's falling asleep or staying asleep, or in some cases, sleeping too much. And so, paying attention to the way that stress is showing up for you in your bedtime area is really important. We had done a whole workshop a few months ago on good sleep hygiene. So there are a lot of very concrete lifestyle steps that folks can take to improve their sleep, even in the face of stress. But working to reduce your stress in the first place can be a great way to get more sleep. And chronic sleep deprivation is related to many of the issues that we've already covered, as well as kind of neurocognitive decline, so dementia and Alzheimer's, and just sort of those brain-based deficits that folks experience as they age. So it becomes kind of this self-feeding cycle. You've got all these health and medical conditions that are impacted by stress, and stress can impact your sleep, which is going to cause more dysfunction in some of these other health and medical areas. So um, I don't want this to sound so Debbie Downer. I feel like we're going to get to the good stuff, I promise. But it's important to recognize just sort of how damaging this can be. I think a lot of people are prone to just kind of shrugging it off and being like, yeah, I'm stressed out. I've been stressed out since I hit adulthood. And I get that a lot of people do feel that way. But it's important to recognize how deeply this impacts us. In terms of sexual desire and sexual function, those areas can also be negatively impacted by stress, whether it involves kind of reducing libido or just being able to function within normal ranges. So, if that's something that's important to you, that can be a great motivator to reduce your stress. And then, as I mentioned previously, sort of the hyper arousal and the way that that impacts us on a neurological level. Our stress response activates and deactivates accordingly our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, which is that fight, flight, or freeze response. And the more that our brains go to that, the more that there's that arousal system turn on. The more frequently it becomes like a trigger, and then it's just easier to get there every single time. And so anytime then you face a stressful situation, it's like everything turns on full blast, because that's how your brain has learned how to respond due to this kind of pervasive hyper arousal. And so stress begets more stress. And so one of the things that you want to be really mindful of is just how that is influencing your biochemistry, but then also the ways that you can help sort of de-escalate that through breathing, through calming techniques, and meditation. And then outside of the body, stress also has a lot of impact on our behavior. So people who are chronically stressed may be more irritable. They may experience difficulty with focus, concentration, memory to some extent also. So you just find like you're really forgetful. It can strain relationships and just really be disruptive in everyday life functioning. And as you can imagine, the experience of those side effects can then lead to more stress. You're stressed out, you come home, you're mean to your partner, now you're in a fight with your partner, and now you're stressed out because you're fighting with your partner. And the cycle just continues to go on and on like that forever. So you want to look at the ways that you can break that cycle. And so we're going to talk about that in just a second. So, in terms of how to best cope with stress, there are things that you can do internally, behaviorally, around lifestyle, and there's things that you can do, outside of yourself. If you're finding that your job is your source of stress, really evaluating, is there a change that you can make there? And obviously, that's not something that's true for everybody. Sometimes you're in a situation and there are not a lot of other options. So, that's a choice that only you know for yourself. But, taking a hard look at where the sources of stress are in your life, looking at the places where you do have a choice, and then taking those steps when necessary, I think is really important. And then when you don't necessarily have that place of empowerment to work, what are things that you can do in your life and in your own mind and body to help kind of mitigate the stresses that you're confronting? So, first, I would say connect to a support system. That can be your friends and your family. It can be people, if you are in a really high stress industry, is there a professional network that you can be a part of? When I'm teaching grad students who are going to become mental health and school counselors, I always talk to them about the importance of both having strong supervisors, so having somebody above you that supports you and that you can talk to when you're really struggling with a high stress and high demanding career field, but then also having a network of peers that understand the demands of that life. So if you're in a really high stress job, are you connected with other folks in your industry that kind of get it? And if it's not, this is kind of applicable to a lot of different things in our lives that create stress. So one of the things I talk about a lot is I am the parent of a child with a disability, and the community of other mothers that I'm connected with who also have a child with a disability, and specifically the moms who have a child with the same disability my kid has been life-saving so much, because I don't have to tell the whole story to get somebody to understand what I'm dealing with. I can just jump in and be like, so this is what's on our plate right now. And there's this kind of immediate understanding and compassion and empathy. And having that network of people has really helped me deal with the personal stressors of raising a child with a disability. So finding, if there's a way that you can connect with others around that particular source of stress in your life, or just having, a really strong social support, friends and family and that type of thing, but having other people that you can lean on. Another way to deal with stress actually is exercise. It burns off a lot of that nervous energy. It makes you tired, so you sleep a little bit better. But I find just sort of the activity piece of it really helps kind of calm my systems down. When I get stressed out, I need to move. So sometimes it's even just like taking a walk. Going for a run, going for a hike, something like that. But just, moving the body in a way that feels good for you, and whatever you feel inclined to do can really have a positive impact on both your mood and your body. So because physical fitness can undo so many of those physical challenges that we talked about that stress can induce on our bodies, you're actually able to undo some of those things that stress might be causing for you from a physical and medical perspective. As I mentioned, getting good sleep, and I know there's such a tough tie there that sometimes, the stress is what's keeping you from sleeping. But getting good sleep can actually really, really help you deal with stress in such an effective way. Everything is harder when you're not sleeping, including your frustration tolerance and your ability to deal with small everyday problems. So, looking at your sleep hygiene, as I mentioned, we did a whole other workshop on that. So, I'm not going to go deep into it, but really thinking about your behavior around alcohol and caffeine, using devices late at night, trying to eliminate that as much as possible, using meditation or yoga, exercising. So there's a lot of different things that you can do in your daily life that will help you sleep. And so the more that you can do that, the better position you're going to put yourself in to be able to deal with the stressors that you might be encountering. Special mention for meditation and mindfulness, which, as I mentioned at the beginning, is one of the things that I teach. And there's a few different ways that I think meditation and mindfulness work to help us reduce stress. Meditation, in and of itself, is very grounding. One of the key aspects of meditation practice is breathing, and breathing in and of itself, all by itself, with nothing else. Breathing, particularly deep into the belly, diaphragmatic breathing, will help turn off that arousal system. So when you're feeling that fight, flight, or freeze response, when you feel that arousal system turn on, just taking 3 deep breaths into the belly can deactivate all of that. And that helps you then respond instead of react. It helps you be more mindful. It helps you be calm. You can employ more rational thought processes to the situation, and it's good for your body. It also has been found to do that rewiring of the brain that we talked about. So when you are kind of in a place of habitually responding with a stress response in all sorts of environments, and that's become now the way that your neurology has been wired due to kind of this repetitive way of being, meditation has been clinically found to undo that and to break that habitual response. So you can teach your brain and your body to react to stress in a different way through a regular meditation practice. And then when we talk about mindfulness, which is a way of living that you learn through the practice of meditation, when you employ mindfulness in your life, that really helps you explore thoughtfully what it is that is triggering you in a stressful situation. So much of our stress response is one, deeply personal, and two, related more to the way that we think about or process the situation that we encounter more than the situation itself. Right. So thinking about if you are in a small fender bender, right? We're going to assume that everybody is safe, nobody's hurt. It's just you got a little crack in your car now. What are you telling yourself about that situation, and how is that informing the way that your mind and your body are reacting to it? If you're able to stay calm, stay grounded, stay centered, this is inconvenient, recognize your feelings, this sucks, but I'm going to be okay, I'm going to work through it, versus if your brain automatically explodes into a chaos of this is the worst possible thing that has ever happened, and you're spinning this tale about just how it is the most awful catastrophe you've ever lived through, your mind and your body are going to respond depending on which one of those thought processes you adopt. And so by engaging in mindfulness, you can start to notice, what do I tell myself in stressful situations? Do I tell myself it's a catastrophe? Do I tell myself it's awful? Do I tell myself it's the worst thing ever? Or am I able to calm myself and be grounded and be focused and think thoughtfully through, the solution to the problem, or think about, kind of realistically what the consequences are of this situation. Um, and it's also, mindfulness can be really helpful in just sort of learning what your specific triggers are. So one of the things that's really important to remember is that what's stressful for me might not be stressful for you. What's stressful to you might not be stressful to me. by being mindful, by being able to be in touch with what are you thinking about a situation, what story are you telling yourself about it, and how is this showing up for you in your body. By being mindful and thoughtful about all of those things, you can start to recognize what your specific stress triggers are, and then you can either learn to cope with them, or if they're things that you don't have to engage with anymore, then you can make the choice to not engage with that stressful thing anymore. An example being, stress for me is found on a golf course. And there's nothing in the world that infuriates me more than trying to golf. So I just don't do that. I don't have to, and so I don't. So you can start to learn where your stress triggers are, and then make the appropriate and safe and healthy decisions for you about how much you want to engage with those triggers, or identify ways that you can effectively cope with them. And then finally, looking at some professional health advice, and that can be medical. So it can be looking at ways to take good care of your body, or it might be mental health. And so looking at maybe engaging with a therapist, or another helping professional to help you get started on identifying what your stress triggers are, and identifying and utilizing good coping. Because sometimes you know that you need to make a change, you know that you need to cope better with the stressors in your life, but you don't know what that means. And that's okay, because everybody starts somewhere. And if you haven't built those good coping skills, then it makes perfect sense that you wouldn't necessarily know what works for you. And a therapist or mental health professional can help you start to just identify what is going to resonate with you, what you're going to respond to, and what's going to fit in your life, and be helpful in the particular circumstances that you're facing. So finally, just to kind of wrap up, the changes that you can make, because you do have more control over your body and your mind's relationship with stress than you think. So, starting with taking care of your mind and your body. A while ago, we had also done a workshop on self care. And I don't necessarily just mean like, getting a massage, but really taking good care of yourself, eating nutrition. I can't speak right now. Nutritious foods that make you feel good, that make your body feel good, getting enough hydration, getting enough sleep, paying attention to things that don't feel so good in your body, being mindful of your relationship with caffeine and with alcohol, with other drugs, and just really taking good care of your mind and your body. Noticing your thoughts, particularly that inner narrative of how you're interpreting the things that you live through, and what stories you're telling yourself about what they mean and what your abilities are to cope with them. And notice the reactions that you have, both to those stories and to the different things that you encounter that are stressful. And then finally, asking for help and maintaining good boundaries in your relationships. So, asking for help can be something that is of your friends and family. When you just feel like you need a little extra support, can you say those words? You say, I'm really struggling and I just need somebody to talk to. Maybe it's professional help. Or maybe it's instilling some boundaries between you and the other people in your life, so that you can then do those other things, like take good care of your mind and your body, take good care of your thoughts and your reactions. When you feel like you're being pulled in too many directions, that can be stressful in and of itself. And so sometimes a great way to deal with stress is really just to have some good boundaries in your life. It doesn't mean cutting people out. It doesn't mean shutting down. It doesn't mean that you're being selfish. It just means that you have the ability to sometimes open that door, and then maybe sometimes close that door, so that you can do the things that you need to do to take care of you. So typically, this would be the part where we would take some questions. But in thinking about all of the content that we just covered, what are some things where you would envision that you could need some support, whether it's just identifying different ways of coping, or identifying other resources in your life or in your community, that would help you in that way. I see a face.
Okay, I am just going to go ahead and plug that there is a list on our website of some free mental well-being resources on the EPLM website. So it includes, Project Hope, the Project Hope website, and the free mindfulness thing that New York has access to right now from Headspace. So, they're all free resources, but they're curated and collected there. So if you wanted to check them out, just go on eplm.org and click on the mental well-being page, and you can find a list of resources specific to Ellenville.
Yay, perfect. Which takes us to our next section, which is how to also connect with me online. If folks are looking to do that, I'm on all of the social media at the same handle, which is at soloveyholistic.com. And you can reach me by email, stop by my website, or give me a call. I'm happy to answer any individual questions or just sort of provide some support and some feedback if there are questions or concerns about the content of this workshop. And that is the end of my show.